Around the world, at many different railways, you might find different replicas of Thomas the Tank Engine, many varying in style but all trying to represent the same thing, the cheeky blue puffball. And many of these are pretty widely known, for example the Thomas at Strasbourg, or the Thomas at the Oigawa Railway, not to mention the various other engines that are temporarily painted like Thomas, or other characters from the series. As nice as those replicas may be, today I'd like to tell you guys about the first Thomas, which technically isn't a replica. Specifically, this locomotive is known as the Hudswell Clark Works number 1800, and was named Thomas by the Reverend W. Awdry himself, the person who created Thomas. So instead of being a replica of the engine, it was more deemed the engine, by the most credible of sources. And starting off, the locomotive itself was built in 1947, as you could have guessed by Hudswell and Clark, for the British Sugar Corporation, or the BSC, to work at Woodston at Peterborough. It was one of only 2 steam locomotives built for the new BSC after the Second World War, before the total commitment to diesel. It was also the largest steam locomotive owned by the BSC, and remained at Woodston for all of its working life, where it was used daily in the sugar beet season, when it would push wagons of beet from the farms up the steeply graded line to be unloaded at the factories. It would also marshal lengthy trains in the extensive siding that the BSC had, that being near the Fletton Loop, just east of the Orton Mere Station. In the late 1960s, diesel traction took over all of the duties that the locomotive still performed, but it was still maintained and kept in a good condition. In 1970, the newly formed Peterborough Railway Society, which later became the Nene Valley Railway, set up their working base in a compound within the sidings owned by the BSC. The locomotive itself acquired the nickname Thomas at this stage, that being because of its blue livery, of course. In 1971, the author of the Thomas books, the Reverend W. Awdry, would officially name the locomotive Thomas. In 1973, the locomotive was put back into use, once again during the harvesting season between autumn and spring. However, surprisingly after, the BSC would sell the locomotive, that to the Peterborough Railway Society, for a nominal £100. The society stored the locomotive for several years, until eventually parts, including a good boiler, from a similar locomotive were purchased from the NCB Whitwood Colliery. By 1979, it was back in steam as a major attraction at the Nene Valley Railway, at Wansford, where it currently resides today. Quite funnily, following the failure of a diesel shunter at the BSC plant in 1986, the locomotive would return to its old haunts to work as a shunter again for a single day, while the diesel was repaired. In the 1980s, the locomotive, dressed as Thomas, visited the Great Western Society at Didcot. Crowds coming to see the now famous engine turned out so large that the police had to be called to control the traffic. Thomas also made visits to the Leicester and Cambridge Railway to promote the Nene Valley Railway. I also probably butchered that, oops. At a BR Open Day at Cambridge in September of 1990, it even took part in running a shuttle service under the overhead electrical wires, the first industrial steam locomotive to ever do so. In the early 1990s, with its 10-year boiler certificate expired, Thomas underwent a major overhaul by NVR's Wansford engineers, but work on major items was contracted out. The wheels were reworked by a Chatham-based special firm, while the boiler work was carried out at Swindon, at the cost of many thousands of pounds. During this rebuild, vacuum brake equipment was also fitted to the locomotive. There followed another period where the locomotive attracted large crowds who wanted to see Thomas. At his Wansford home, as many as 8,000 visitors turned out to see Thomas at just one working weekend. It was taken out of service again in 2002 for another 10-year overhaul, with the work being undertaken on a contract basis, at a cost of almost £100,000, away from the Nene Valley Railway because of pressures from other work. The locomotive continued to run as Thomas again until being taken out of service in 2013, again for another overhaul. It would return to steam again in June of 2016. The locomotive itself remains based on the Nene Valley Railway, where currently it's restricted to operating around the yard at Wansford and hauling Wansford-Yarwell Junction shuttles. It does, however, make an annual trip around to Peterborough once a year. When I think of missed opportunities in railroading history, 2 things often come to mind. One, of course, being the amount of steam engines that were scrapped rather than preserved, and 2, when British Rail combined 2 Class 08s and called it the Class 13 instead of the Class 16, which may have already existed at the time, but still, consistency. Recently, I've found myself researching different types of locomotives that I found interesting, and this all happened to start with the Class 13 and being mentioned a lot on Twitter, so I figured it'd make a good start for this little series. Like I said in the intro, the Class 13 was basically two Class 08s pushed together, but there is a bit more to it than that. That's more of a face value description. The British Rail Class 13 was a type of diesel-electric shunting locomotive, and was designed in 1965. This being because the marshalling yards at Tinsley needed more powerful locomotives. Because of Tinsley's status as a hump yard, it wasn't possible to use a single locomotive due to the risk of grounding. So, in an effort to achieve the required power, a pair of Class 08 shunters were permanently coupled in a master and slave formation, with the slave unit having its cab removed. Both units were then ballasted to improve traction. Initially, these designs were coupled cab to cab. However, it was found more practical to couple master nose to slave cab, thus leading to the more common formation we see here. While the slave unit in the front was powered, control to the locomotive was kept in the master unit, and it would be here where the operators would operate the engine. A total of 3 units were built at Darlington Works, that being the builder and rebuilder of the class, and on average the locomotives had a length of about 60 feet 1 inch. They would operate with vacuum brakes, and could achieve top speeds of about 20 miles per hour. However, what the locomotive lacked in speed, it more than made up for in tractive effort, coming in at a maximum of 70,000 pounds, and a brake force of over 37 long tons. The engines were numbered D4500 to D4502, later 13001 to 13003, but would be retired between 1981 and 1985. With the end of hump shunting at Tinsley, the class would become obsolete. The unique qualities of the locomotives were not required elsewhere, so withdrawal of them was honestly inevitable. 13002 was withdrawn in 1981, with the remaining 2 locomotives going with the closure of Tinsley Hump in 1985. None of this unusual class would survive, and all 3 units would end up scrapped. Honestly, a sad fate for such a unique locomotive, but nonetheless something a rail fan can still marvel at. As simple as permanently coupling 2 locomotives together sounds, it worked quite effectively, and helped to create one of the most powerful and most unique shunter designs the history of railroading has ever seen. And now, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll excuse me, I have a new splatter and dodge headcanon to develop. Locomotives and trains are very large machines, and because of that large size are often seen as quite wondrous, if not at times confusing or intimidating. But what about the smaller locomotives? Well, in today's case, I wouldn't say intimidating fits the bill. So, quoting my sources directly, the Kitten Sons Works number 1900-040T is the smallest standard gauge British steam locomotive ever built, and is nicknamed the Flying Buffer Beam because of this and its understandably strange appearance. Being built in 1936 at a cost of only 850 pounds, the locomotive was designed to work within the tight loading gauge restrictions at Holywell, and in size was only about 5 feet 9 inches tall, weighing about 11 tons. It is the only one of its type. Its wheels were only 2 feet in diameter, and the outside cylinders were 8 inch by 12 inch. So yeah, it's definitely a pretty small locomotive. A normal-sized person is taller than this. The locomotive would mainly see use as a shunter, moving loads of waste from the rayon fiber manufacturing process out of the plant and onto the seawall from where it was dumped. This operation was a complicated one, however. This headed by the fact that the Holywell site was split in 2 by the LMS Chester and Holyhead line. The 2 parts of the site were linked by a short tunnel under the LMS line, but this would result in there being steep inclines on either side of the tunnel. The locomotive was required to work flat out on the descent in order to be able to climb up the other side. In 1954, the operation was replaced by a rope incline and 2 diesel locomotives, one on either side of the tunnel, due to concerns over the safety of the operation, and thus making 1900 redundant and not needed. The locomotive was soon returned to Atlas Works, and here it was overhauled and given a new firebox, then delivered to Grimsby, where a new plant was being constructed. Here, an extension was fitted to the cab to increase its height, and the engine was set to work on construction trains. When the factory was completed, it took the delivery of a Sentinel locomotive, and 1900 was kept as a spare. It was last used by this plant in the early 60s, where it then would remain in storage. That is, until it was purchased by the Ktten Railway Society, and arrived at the Buckingham Railway Centre in September of 1971. The locomotive's restoration then started, where it gained the name Jill. Before the work was completed, the locomotive was sold to another QRS member, who completed its overhaul. At the same time, the opportunity was taken to remove the cab extension. During 1980, the engine returned to service and was fitted with vacuum brakes. It even employed a lightweight passenger train and demonstration freight trains. The locomotive spent the summer of 1983 on the Lakeside and Haverthwaite Railway, where it completed 35 miles on light passenger services. On the way home, the tiny locomotive visited Steamtown Carnforth, and would actually spend 2 months in the company of Flying Scotsman and Lord Nelson. After a number of years of operation, the boiler ticket expired, and the locomotive itself was taken out of service. It, as of now, is undergoing its second major overhaul in preservation, and I'm sure it won't be too long until we see this locomotive running again. There's even a Facebook page which currently shows the progress of such. Sadly, because of COVID, the work has been quite strenuous, but for those interested, I'll leave that linked below. I highly recommend checking it out. So, despite being one of the smallest locomotives to ever see the light of day, I'd argue there's still quite a bit to marvel at. Whether it's the design, the history behind it, it really was a blast to research, and hopefully you guys enjoyed learning a little bit more about it. If you guys did, be sure to like and subscribe for even more train content, and if there's any other locomotives I should make a video about, be sure to comment down below and let me know. There's honestly so much to choose from, some help would be nice. As always guys, thanks again for watching, and with all of that being said, hopefully I'll see you guys in the next one. Most cultured individuals share one trait, and that's an appreciation for calling all engines. And in that movie, we're shown one thing. Sometimes in life, you have your diesel locomotives, and other times in life, you'll have your steam locomotives. But what would you get if you were to combine those two? Not you, nobody asked you, get out of here. Well, if you were around the LNER between 1933 and 1934, you would have seen just that. Specifically, the Kitten Still locomotive. Or if you didn't pick it up from the intro, a locomotive that utilizes steam and diesel power. And technically this engine wasn't an LNER engine. However, it ran most of its trials on LNER lines, as well as ran a daily freight service from York. Now, the Still engine as a design had already enjoyed some success in marine and stationary applications. The basic principle was that of a diesel engine with double-acting pistons. One side of the pistons was diesel, and the other side was operated by steam. The engine was started by steam, and when sufficient speeds were reached, diesel fuel was injected into the diesel side of the cylinder. The steam starting allowed a direct propulsion without any form of transmission. Although electric transmission is used on virtually all modern diesel locomotives today, it's more that in the 1920s these systems were very immature. The Still arrangement also allowed the steam propulsion to be used as a booster when extra power was required. An oil burner was fitted to the steam boiler to enable initial starting, but exhaust heat from the diesel was also used to partially heat the steam. This improved the locomotive's efficiency by about 40%, exceeding all contemporary engines. In the 1920s, diesel locomotives were still at a primitive state, and Kitten & Co. of Leeds believed the Still principle could be applied. Patents were filed in the early 1920s, and construction of an experimental engine started in 1924. This engine had a 262T or 1C1 wheel arrangement, with 8 cylinders arranged in 2 horizontal banks. The cylinders were also parallel with the drive axles, and were all operated by a central crankshaft. Gears, a lay shift, and coupling rods transferred the power from the crankshaft to the 3 drive axles. The relatively small boiler was positioned above the engine, and had a cylindrical oil-burning firebox. Exhaust gases from the diesel engine fed through the tubes in the boiler, and the boiler water also circulated through the cylinder cooling jacket. Both circulation systems helped to capture waste heat from the diesel process, and steam was used for many auxiliary systems such as the brakes and whistle. The oil burner was used to create steam for starting. When about 5 miles per hour was reached, diesel fuel was injected to the diesel ends, and after about 2 revolutions, the steam was then shut off until needed for the next start, or just as an extra boost. This design speed was a maximum of 43 miles per hour. However, this was increased to 55 as tests proceeded. As well as great starting abilities, the Kitten Still was found to consume about 1/5 of the fuel by weight compared to a typical coal-burning steam engine. The exact economics would vary according to the relative prices of coal and oil fuel. However, Kitten planned to target countries with good oil supplies, but no coal, or at least very little of it. The available power of the locomotive for its size was relatively low, and this would have had to been improved for commercial use. This, however, at the time wasn't possible, and would have required large expenditures which were not available, as Kitten & Co. were pretty down in the dumps finance-wise. Development and testing of the Kitten Still took the better part of 10 years, and with great expense. As such, it was a large contributing factor to the downfall of Kitten & Co., who called in the receivers in 1934. After this, the engine was laid up at York North Shed until at least July 1935, after which it was returned to Kitsen's to be disposed of. By the time Britain's railways were ready to adopt large diesel locomotives, the previous issues with electric and hydraulic transmissions had largely been overcome, and the Kitten Still experiment was forgotten. As stated before, the locomotive was broken up by Kitten & Co. after July of 1935, so unfortunately there are no examples in preservation as of now. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the Kitten Still locomotive. It was April 27th in 1953. The crew of UP 4005 started a routine haul across the southern Wyoming prairie. All things considered, a freight train that was pretty typical. Engineer Leo Murray, fireman Lawrence Enders, and brakeman James R. Anderton made up the head end crew. Conductor James Walker and brakeman Ivan Shurigar would make up the rear end crew. Altogether, the 600-ton big boy would be pulling a 62-car consist with a caboose. Something that may sound pretty daunting to us, but to a big boy and its crew, is really just a normal day, and nobody had suspicion to think it wouldn't be one. At 9:10 a.m., the cavalcade would pass through Wamsutter, Wyoming, headed westbound. This morning was cloudy with a light mist, and with the consist being on a slight descending grade, everything seemed to make for easy travel. At this same time, just 8.5 miles to the west, unfortunately another event was occurring. A station gang had traveled 3.6 miles to the east to Red Desert on a track motorcar, all to obtain some switch ties. Instead, however, the foreman and 4-section workers upon arriving in Red Desert were approached by a sheep herder, who requested assistance getting his sheep across the tracks. The foreman called ahead to receive a track lineup, and after receiving such information, assigned one section man to proceed eastward and another westward, to provide protection at each end of the track. After one eastbound and one westbound train passed by, they were to provide protection for the sheep herder. As an additional protection, 2 other section men were to open a switch in each main track, which would lead both to a siding. This would display a block signal down the track in each direction, and would warn any unannounced approaching trains to slow down. Only 10 minutes down these same rails, however, was 4005 and its 62-car consist very quickly. While approaching the Red Desert siding from the east end, the section man opened the siding switch, and then, seeing the massive locomotive barreling down on him, frantically would make an unsuccessful attempt to close it before the engine passed. The engineer would apply the brakes, but very little could be done. Unfortunately, the train entered the siding going almost 50 miles an hour. With 4005 entering the switch so quickly, the locomotive would consequently careen off the rails, skidding along for quite a while, destroying rail and roadbed, with the tender and first 18 cars also derailing. The locomotive's cab was completely destroyed, as the tender tore into it, twisting and smashing the metal, as the first 12 cars were badly damaged and piled onto each other in a very large heap. Cars 13 through 17 were somewhat damaged from the initial impact, and scattered about the scene was the train's load, ranging from broken tractors to dead hogs, typewriters, and sewing machines. Engineer Leo Murray and fireman Lawrence Enders were killed instantly, though amazingly the front brakeman James Anderton was alive, and was found with the rear-end crew, conductor, and rear brakeman in a daze. The rear crew didn't know anything was wrong until they saw the emergency signal from the engineer. By the time they looked out, they saw the cars piling on top of each other, and both rushed out of the caboose. Walker would head to the train's front, using a dispatcher's phone to call in what happened, but sadly could not get near the actual wreck, as hissing steam would billow from the injured locomotive. It took nearly 25 minutes for that same steam to subside. Shurigar would protect the rear of the train by walking a mile back east and setting detonators on the track, or 2 torpedoes that would warn oncoming trains to stop. Brakeman Anderton's left leg was twisted and pinned between a wooden seat and steel side of the cab. Where he was trapped was no more than 18 inches tall and 4 feet across. He was trapped in these conditions for 10 hours, as rescue workers would remove tons of steel and coal, all in an attempt to free him. He would only ask for a drink of water and a cigarette. After some time, a doctor was able to reach into a narrow opening and administer a dose of morphine to subside his pain. He later told rescuers that his hands hurt and he was chilling a little bit, but could no longer feel the pain in his foot. The most chilling quote from this story also comes from Anderton, where he told a rescue worker, "He threw it right in front of us. The switch. They threw it right in front of us. They didn't give us a chance. I felt the engine rock. I don't know how many times it rocked. The next thing I knew, I felt the steam hitting me in the face, and I thought I was a goner. All I could think about was getting my hands over my face." 2 days later, at 10:57 a.m., unfortunately, Anderton too would pass away. Second and third degree burns covered 80% of his body. Sadly, that would mix with prolonged shock and other complications. Early reports indicated the engineer and firemen alive after the accident, as 2 workers said they spoke to the men. This later turned out to be false. The 2 workers were actually talking to each other from opposite sides of the train. Track crews worked swiftly to clear the wreckage. East and west rail traffic was delayed for only about 9 hours, all thanks to a shoe fly installed by a construction crew, which routed rail traffic around the accident site. Priority was taken to resume a normal traffic schedule, so some westbound trains were then rerouted. And while many of the 4 carloads of pigs were killed upon impact, some pigs would actually provide comic relief. Workmen reported that occasionally a pig would regain consciousness, let out a terrific grunt, and take off running through the curious bystanders. Though, as I'm sure you can tell, this ultimately was no laughing matter. The only way I can think to wrap up this tragic tale is with another quote, this time from a friend and fellow railwayman who knew Enders. "Several days later, I was back at work on the graveyard shift, and the dispatcher told us the engine from the derailment was being brought back in, and was just at the west end of the yard getting ready to come past. We all stood outside, and in the still of the darkness, not yet visible, we could hear this croning and wrenching of metal, coming very slowly down the rails, being brought in behind the wrecking train. It was the big boy, and it gave you a very eerie feeling, as it became visible in the old lamps of the dispatch office. Slowly it came into view, and if I ever thought I had seen a ghost, this was it. I did not know a big boy could die, but there it was, and how sad it was, just limping along like an old gray horse with one broken leg. The cab was completely gone. Only the gray color of the firebox was visible, and some of the side rods were missing. It looked as if even the frame had been broken. It just lumbered by us all, standing there with our mouths open, not believing what we were seeing. This once huge, big, beautiful thing, that was once a living machine of giant steel, it disappeared into the darkness like it came, being dragged like a person to the grave, at the east end of the yard for temporary storage. I could almost see Fireman Enders waving at me as it went past. What even is the Oigawa Railway, Toby?
I got the USB cord. It's plugged to my microphone. I'm gonna talk to the power. I can't pay electric bill.
Well, inevitable jokes aside, surprisingly not that. Well, for starters, the engine we're looking at is a DD-20, a main locomotive on the Southern Alps About line, which was introduced in 1982. Specifically at Oigawa, there are currently 6 of these carriages running, and each one has its own name, as you can see on screen. Due to appearances and the line these happen to operate on, most people do assume that they are electric. But believe it or not, these engines are diesel operated, hauling trains on the Aikawa section of the railway. The train does have electric banking engines added for the about rack portion, however, so this engine directly is not electric, but it's not entirely wrong to make the joke, or comparison. Some people have made the mistake of calling this Toby narrow gauge. This, however, is not true. Instead, he is a part of a light railway, which in direct definition is a railway built at lower costs, more typically with lower standards than heavy rail, using lighter weight track, maybe steeper gradients, tighter curves, and they reduce civil engineering costs. This in turn makes Toby and the DD-20s look puny when they actually run on the same gauge as the other engines. Unfortunately, I'm not sure which of the original 6 carriages were used to make Toby, though it would have been cool if he was a entirely new build, you know, making him the 7th vehicle, since he's Sodor's 7th engine, you know what I mean. Unfortunately, you can only find Toby running on the Oigawa River section, where he was unveiled to locals on August 17th. before starting operation on August 19th. One of the cooler things I think Toby does is he actually talks to the passengers inside of him. Well, not the train, you know what I mean, again. And in these announcements, Toby says, "Hello everyone, it's me, Toby. Does everyone know me? Thomas runs on the Oigawa main line, but I'm the only one who runs on the Aikawa line to Okizumi? I probably said that very wrong. You can open the window by hand, so enjoy the scenery a lot." He also makes other announcements such as, "Everyone can see the river outside the window. That's Oigawa. It's flowing slowly and slowly like me. It's really full of nature here, and it feels so good." Not only that, but Toby can actually talk to the children. For example, as he goes really close to the trees, he says, "My face is so close," or "I think my face is going to hit me and it hurts." These translations are not doing this very well. Or if a child asks Toby how it was, he'll say it was fun or it was cool. Something that I wish was at every Day Out with Thomas event. And now that we've explained this thing, I'm sure you're wondering how I feel about it. You know, being the dark side of Day Out with Thomas guy and all. This thing is fucking awesome. When I think of Oigawa, I think of one term. First, get your facts straight and then distort them at your own leisure. I'd personally say Oigawa embodies this to the best degree. Most of the engines they have do not look like Thomas characters. Thomas looks really nothing like a C11. But when you look at their Thomas, which happens to be a C11, it looks exactly like Kitten Still. And that's because they get every other detail right. The color, the face, the livery. That's basically the color. Shut up. They get every detail they can about the character right when making it into a real engine, while also maintaining the integrity of that original engine. They don't butcher them and turn them into other things. Instead, they become integral parts of that railway. Plus, Oigawa's made bulgy and birdy and rusty and troublesome trucks, and Oigawa's the closest thing you're going to get to being on Sodor. So, as strange as the basis they chose is, I'm honestly just happy to see Toby being represented, even if he does look like a Lincoln Logs kit. But be sure to let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Let's all be honest with ourselves. Who doesn't love a good pug? An English pug, a Scottish pug, a fat pug, a small pug. In general, they're pretty adorable. That being said, when I first heard the term pug in a railway sense, it was, to say the least, confusing. For example, a lot of people, myself included, at first thought this referred to a single class. That is not true. The term pug is a general one. And secondly, who thought of this? It kind of works. This is somewhat fitting. So with all of that being said, ladies and gentlemen, today I'll be explaining to you what exactly that term means, as well as where it comes from and what exactly it refers to in an engine. This is probably already, yeah, I know, it's a bit weird. You'll be with me by the end though, I'm sure. Just run with me. When you hear the term pug, you probably think of an 040, something like an LNYR Class 21. Something smaller used for shunting duties, not a big engine. But surprisingly, it doesn't apply to just that. Many different types of tank engines were called pugs. It was a general term used for basically every tank engine. For example, the GSWR 540 class. This was called a pug, or more commonly the big pugs, if you asked an engineman. And believe it or not, the term itself is a Scottish one. Pug is a Scottish dialect meaning monkey, and so inferring an ugly appearance. It's not meant to mean a very good thing. It's inferred that this led to the shorter, more small engines being called this as a, I guess, funny term. Now, more commonly, the term pug is applied to dogs. These are very small dogs with a snub nose and just very squarish body. Now look at most pug locomotives. They were saddle tanks with an overall appearance that was flat-fronted and square. You could say it was people just making a fun comparison. And personally, I like to go with the latter just because the first is a bit more rude, I guess. Definitely doesn't have the fun connotation we thought it did. Now, like I've been saying, there are many examples of pugs. For example, the English pugs, or the LNYR Class 21. There's also the GER Class 209. It's only right, though, that with the term coming from Scotland, some of the more iconic ones come from there as well, or at least saw action there. Here we see the LNER Class Y9 pug, originally a G-Class engine of the North British Railway in Scotland. Now, in Scotland, Nielsen and Company designed and built highly successful pug locomotives in the 1880s, then licensing productions to the largest Scottish railway companies. The Caledonian Railway bought 4 originals from Nielsen's, before constructing a further 34 at their own works. These were designated the Caledonian 0F class. The North British Railway bought 2 originals from Nielsen before constructing a further 36 on their own, then designating them the NBR G class, also commonly nicknamed pugs by North British staff. More than 100 of this type of pug entered across Scotland. They also saw exceedingly long service, with the final examples of such being withdrawn in the late 1960s. The engines didn't just see success in Scotland and England, however. The pug is literally a worldwide locomotive, such as the meter gauge Black Hawthorn, an 040 ST that was imported to India in 1873. This for an irrigation project and sadly was shunted for several years, this in the later part of its working life. It now can be seen in Plinth, outside of Ajmer Works. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the very convoluted explanation as to why pugs are called pugs, and also why that term is, I guess, a little bit controversial. I didn't know I was insulting them this entire time. I have a lot of apologizing to. Hey, Percy. Yeah, sorry about that one, bro. Misty Island. What a stupid movie. Awesome, there's an island that's right there that nobody has ever noticed before? That's awesome. Creative writing. And don't get me started on the engines on the island. American steam engines on a British island. What? Who refuels these things? Who's operating them? Ferdinand is very annoying and I hate almost every time he speaks, but at least he has a real life basis. What the hell are Dash and Bash, besides nail marks on the inside of the late Reverend's coffin? Oh, you are kidding. No, is this what we're talking about today? I bet you thought this video was gonna be nothing but Misty Island hate. No, just a good part. As awful as this movie may have been, as awkward as the characters' personalities may be, I'm not gonna act like I don't love a good climax locomotive. And when I found out Dash and Bash have a real-life basis too, I was kinda just confused. As a kid, when I first saw them, they were just kinda odd, off-looking designs that may or may not explode. Of course, later I learned that's just how mining engines are. And to make a long story short, Dash and Bash are based on this beauty right here, the Bear Harbor Lumber Company #1 locomotive, Gypsy. And today I thought it'd be fun to talk about this engine, and the type it is specifically. You see, Gypsy refers to this engine's nickname, but also to the type it's classified as. These engines were built by several small firms in California, and as we can assume, all worked in California as well. How 2 of them would have got to the British mainland? That's up for you to decide. The engines themselves were very versatile though. These weren't your normal logging locomotives, they were also yarding engines, which basically means they could be operated the same way as any other engine, or with their attached spool and cable, drag logs from loading points that weren't too far from the track. This normally was a function that was dedicated to a single engine, referred to as a donkey in practice. The Gypsy locomotive, however, completely ridded the need of a second engine, along with the usual crew of men it took to operate it, plus the expenses too. When it came to the Gypsy engines, there were 2 styles, one being a standard rod-type locomotive, which honestly is pretty basic when compared to other engines. They utilized forward-mounted horizontal cylinders and a side rod for locomotion. A 3rd cylinder was dedicated to the yarding mechanism. This mechanism was pretty simple too, being pretty much just a set of gears that turned 1 or 2 cable spools for yarding whatever log they needed to yard. The other type of Gypsy locomotive was a geared drive locomotive, and this is where things get kinda complicated, so try to keep up if you can. These locomotives would utilize gears with only 2 cylinders, both for the purpose of locomotion and yarding the logs. Like I said, this type of engine was way more complicated, and I'll try not to bore you with too many details here. To put it simply, the locomotive had to be enabled to work either way. Think changing the gears of your car, but imagine you actually had to go to the motor and do it yourself. Maybe not on that same level of complexity, but effort at least. Without the dedicated piston to focus solely on the yarding mechanism, the engine would have to be stopped and switched between the 2 operations whenever needed, with much physical effort from the operators. They basically had to set the pistons to whatever they needed it to be at, or however they needed it to operate. I mean, at least it eliminated the need for a second engine though. But after all of that, I'm sure the crew wished they had one either way. Unfortunately, the Bear Harbor Railroad would come to its end over 100 years ago. this sadly being in 1905. But don't let that stop you from seeing one of these things in person. Thanks to the efforts of the Timber Heritage Association based in Eureka, California, to this day, Chipsy can run the rails proudly, the last of her class still in any sort of operation. No, not those two. Those don't count. They do not count. Fuck those two. They do not count.
Either subscribe, donate, or get the fuck out.